October 18th, 1944. The autumn wind pushed soot across Krakow's railway station, curling it through the broken glass of roof panes shattered by Allied bombs months earlier. Trains moaned and rattled across the platforms, their iron wheels screaming like some wounded animal. Among the coal dust and hurried travelers sat a man in patched clothes, his boots scuffed, his collar turned up to shield him from the cold. In his hands was a dented tin lunchbox. To the casual eye, it held only bread and onion. In truth, beneath the crust of rye was a sliver of film and a crystal for a miniature radio, items that could cost a man his life before the hour was out. He was no French railway worker, though the papers in his pocket said otherwise. He was American, an operative of the OSS, and for the moment, his survival depended on a disguise that he feared might collapse with the wrong glance. The Office of Strategic Services, the young and improvisational ancestor of the CIA, had been born from William Wild Bill Donovan's conviction that America needed a service of shadows to fight a war of shadows. Spies, saboteurs, codebreakers, they were not the men of parades and medals, but the ones who, in Donovan's words, waged the cloak and dagger war. Our operative, let us call him Thomas, though even his name was a borrowed garment, had trained in England on the arts of explosives, disguise, and coded transmissions. He had been taught how to vanish into a crowd, how to forge documents in candlelight, how to take apart a German rifle blindfolded. None of those lessons prepared him for the station bench where, under the watchful eyes of Gestapo patrols, he rehearsed the accent of a man from Lyon and prayed his tongue would not betray his heart. His mission had a clarity that seemed simple on paper. Monitor the movement of German trains running eastward, carrying tanks, fuel, and men toward the collapsing front against the Red Army. By the fall of 1944, the Germans were bleeding territory daily, yet they still relied on Poland's railways as their arteries of war. If Thomas could chart those veins, map their schedules, and transmit them to London, Allied bombers could strike more decisively. The lines on his papers were to be timetables, not testimonies. His world was meant to be one of steel and numbers. Yet even in the opening hours of his assignment, the atmosphere conspired against the simplicity of orders. On the bench beside him, two Polish women whispered, not about fuel convoys, but about trains of another kind. "They do not come back," one murmured. She pressed a rosary into her palm as though it could silence her trembling. Thomas pretended not to hear, but the words clung to him like coal dust. He had been briefed on rumors of atrocities, vague reports that civilians vanished, that villages were emptied into cattle cars. But such talk had been dismissed in London as exaggeration, the fog of war made thicker by fear. His orders did not mention it. Still, the unease grew, fed by fragments of conversation caught in crowded platforms and the way locals averted their eyes when smoke rose on the horizon. The local underground, the Armia Krajowa, welcomed him with the suspicion reserved for outsiders who might doom them all with a single mistake. A farmer hid him in a barn loft his first night, handing him a crust of bread so hard it nearly cracked his teeth. The man's wife, eyes shadowed with fatigue, muttered that the Americans always asked for coffee. "Here we drink boiled weeds," she said with a smile so thin it could snap. Thomas forced a laugh. Humor, even bitter, was a bridge. He had been trained to look for such bridges. But he could feel already that this war pressed people into corners where laughter was scarce. In the days that followed, Thomas walked the rail yards in his disguise, head bent like a weary worker, noting car numbers, directions, and times. He traced the lines of coal trains, troop transports, and supply convoys. At night, by the light of a tallow candle in some cellar, he wrote these numbers in code, then tucked the slips into the lining of his coat for courier pickup. The rhythm was mechanical, the kind of work a spy might even find dull. Yet with every line recorded, he felt a weight heavier than timetables settling on him. It was in Krakow that a courier, a girl no older than 16, told him bluntly, "The trains you watch, some carry food, some carry guns, but many carry people, thousands, and they go west of here." Her voice cracked, not with the hesitation of doubt, but with the exhaustion of truth too long ignored. She pointed roughly in the direction of Auschwitz, a name he struggled to pronounce, a place he had never heard in his training. "There is smoke there," she added. and it smells like burning that is not wood. He carried her words with him, trying to bury them beneath the discipline of his orders. Still, when he passed the station again, he noticed the cattle cars. Not the kind meant for livestock, but for people. Slats too narrow for comfort. Chains locked across the doors. Children's faces sometimes appeared at those cracks. He wrote down the train numbers as instructed, but his hands shook. He told himself it was only the cold. The first coded message he sent back to London spoke of fuel shipments, of locomotives hauling tanks toward the Vistula. The second slipped as though by accident into another register. One train, sealed cars, no return. He did not explain. He was not yet ready to believe the implications himself, but he had begun to cross a line, one that would transform his mission from railways to revelation. At night, in barns where straw stuck to his damp clothes, he repeated his cover story like a prayer. French, railway worker. From Lyon. He imagined his accent fooling no one. In truth, it was not the Germans who unsettled him most, but the Poles who said little yet seemed to know everything. When he asked an old man about the smoke beyond the horizon, the man spat and said only, Auschwitz. The words sat like a stone in Thomas's stomach. He did not yet know its full weight. Still, duty demanded repetition. He rose each day to count trains, to feign fatigue, to pass messages through the resistance. The Gestapo prowled with dogs, and any slip could end in a bullet or worse. Yet it was not fear of capture that gnawed at him, but the question that grew louder each day. If the whispers were true, what was his real mission? To bomb bridges or to carry witness? On October 25th, just a week into his assignment, he watched a train of 40 cars roll slowly past, each door chained, each window barred. A woman's hand slipped briefly between the slats, reaching out, as if to touch air one last time. He wrote the number of the train in his notebook, but for the first time he added nothing else. He sat on the bench long after the cars had gone, the sound of their wheels fading into silence. His orders were clear. His conscience was no longer. That night, in the cellar where he prepared his coded report, he hesitated over the cipher pad. The candle sputtered, threatening to die. His pencil hovered above the page. Then he wrote carefully, deliberately, "The trains do not return." It was a phrase without context, without explanation, but it carried a truth too heavy to disguise. When he folded the paper into its hiding place, he knew that whatever mission he thought he had been sent to perform had already changed. And as the courier slipped out into the night with his words tucked in her satchel, Thomas felt the first real weight of what lay ahead. He had come to Poland to measure steel and schedules. He was beginning to realize he had stepped into something far darker, where the numbers were not tanks and fuel, but lives. The nights in occupied Poland were thick with silence, a silence broken only by the rustle of straw when Thomas shifted in a barn loft, or the creak of wood when a hidden door opened. He learned quickly that silence itself was a language here, one spoken by farmers who avoided eye contact, by mothers who clutched their children tighter when a German patrol passed. Even the dogs seemed to bark less, as though noise itself could betray them. Within that silence, whispers moved like smoke, half-truths, fragments of sentences, hints of things no one dared to speak aloud. It was within these whispers that his mission began to transform. The resistance moved him from shelter to shelter, each household staking their lives on his foreign papers and untested disguise. A woman with hollow cheeks pressed a bowl of cabbage soup into his hands and warned, "Eat slowly. The Germans take even hunger as a crime." In another cellar, a man with ink-stained fingers passed him forged railway stamps, muttering, "Our lives depend on your signature being tired enough to look real." Every night, Thomas rehearsed his false history, born in Lyon, worked the rails, displaced by war, until the lies began to feel like memories of another man's life. Yet beneath the rehearsed cover, a different story pulled at him. The couriers and farmers never asked what he had been sent to do. They assumed already that the Allies must know what they themselves had long suspected. Still, when a name slipped in conversation, Auschwitz, voices lowered, eyes darted toward the floor as though the word itself were cursed. It was not spoken like a place, but like a wound. One evening, as he was smuggled beneath hay bales in a creaking wagon, the driver leaned close, his breath sour with tobacco. "You count trains," the man said. "Good, but know this, there are trains you should not count. They are not for soldiers. They are for families. Entire villages vanish into them." Thomas held his tongue, afraid to ask questions that might betray either ignorance or disbelief. But he marked the words in his memory as carefully as he marked train numbers in his notebook. When they reached the outskirts of Auschwitz, the air itself carried an unshakable weight. The sky was streaked with a gray haze that seemed thicker than mist, and the stench, it clung to the skin, acrid and unnatural. Even before he saw the fences, Thomas knew he was near something that was not just a prison. The resistance contact who guided him spat into the dirt and muttered, "It is where the trains do not return." The phrase echoed the words he had already written once in code, and it unsettled him to hear them spoken aloud. By day, he walked with groups of railway laborers, delivering timber and coal, his forged papers convincing enough for guards who were more concerned with their own cigarettes than the workers' origins. From the periphery, he glimpsed the perimeter, barbed wire strung in endless lines, watchtowers looming like skeletons of factories, guards with dogs pacing like restless shadows. Beyond the fences, buildings squatted under plumes of smoke. The smoke was constant, neither rising nor fading, as if the earth itself were exhaling despair. Locals whispered to him in fragments. "My cousin went in. A whole school was sent last spring. If you hear the music, it means more have come." These scraps formed no clear picture, yet they gnawed at the edges of his mind. Each whisper hinted at something so vast and cruel that his training, steeped in sabotage and code, could not frame it. One night, in a cramped attic above a cooper's shop, he met a boy no older than 12. The boy's eyes were wide with a knowledge no child should carry. He said softly, "They burn people, mister. You can smell it. Sometimes the wind blows it this way." Thomas tried to comfort him, offering half of his crust of bread, but the boy shook his head. "Keep it, you'll need it more." The words lodged like thorns. Spies were trained to read signals, to detect lies, but children did not lie about fire. Back in London, the OSS had dismissed early reports of extermination as improbable, the exaggerated fabrications of enemy propaganda, or the desperate pleas of refugees. Yet here in Poland, every whispered word converged into a chorus that could not be ignored. Still, Thomas wrestled with doubt. Was it possible? Could any state, even the Nazis, expend such energy, such resources, simply to kill? Logic demanded skepticism. The air demanded belief. The couriers who carried his messages urged him to keep focus. "Do not get lost in what you cannot prove," one insisted. "Give us bridges, give us fuel depots. The war will be won that way." Thomas nodded, but even as he nodded, he knew his pencil would not stop at bridges. Already his last dispatch had hinted at human cargo. Already he felt himself slipping into a role beyond the one assigned. He was not only counting trains, he was beginning to listen to their silence. And yet, amidst the heaviness, there were moments of brittle irony that kept despair from swallowing him whole. One courier, carrying a bundle of forged documents, teased him. "Americans always ask for coffee. Here you get boiled weeds, strong enough to clean a rifle barrel." Thomas laughed, though the taste lingered bitter on his tongue. Humor here was not escape, it was defiance, a spark against the smothering dark. Each passing day brought him closer to the realization that the whispers were not just rumors, but a map leading toward a reality his mind resisted. The faint music drifting over fields, violins played by prisoners forced into orchestras, became a cruel punctuation to the smoke above. He saw in fleeting glimpses carts of clothing, shoes piled in corners, guards kicking at the dirt with boots polished too clean for laborers. It was as if the ordinary machinery of a railway had been bent to a purpose beyond comprehension. On November 1st, he stood at a siding where a train slowed. He pretended to jot numbers for scheduling, but what he saw was not soldiers unloading crates. It was mothers clutching children, old men stumbling, young boys gripping each other's hands. They were herded with shouts and rifle butts toward gates crowned with wire. He could not move, could not breathe. His pencil snapped between his fingers. Later in the safe house, he told himself he must have misunderstood, that perhaps it was only relocation, that perhaps... But the whispers returned, steady and relentless. They do not come back. The mission he had accepted in London was shifting into something else entirely. He had expected to count locomotives and tanks. Now he was counting lives, even if only in shadows. And with every whisper, every glimpse, he felt himself being drawn into a truth that terrified him more than capture ever could. That night, in the barn loft, the courier asked if he had seen enough to report. Thomas did not answer. Instead, he stared through a crack in the roof at the smoke drifting across the stars. And for the first time, he wondered whether his pen, his codes, his fragile channels back to London could ever carry the weight of what he was witnessing. The silence pressed in until he could hardly breathe. Then he whispered, not to the courier, not to anyone, but to himself, as though confessing, "It's not trains, it's people." The first time Thomas stepped close enough to glimpse the ramp, he felt the ground shift beneath his feet, as though the earth itself recoiled from what it was forced to carry. He had been smuggled in with a group of railway laborers delivering timber, his forged papers stamped with ink that smelled faintly of vinegar. The guards barely looked at him, distracted by cigarettes and muttered complaints about rations. For a moment he believed the disguise had succeeded. Then his eyes lifted, and the scene tore through the fragile walls of denial he had been building since Krakow. A train stood open on the siding, cattle cars creaking in the cold air. From within poured a flood of human beings, men, women, children clutching bundles, some barefoot, others still in coats that hinted of distant cities. They stumbled onto the gravel, blinking against the glare of floodlights driven forward by shouts and dogs. An SS officer gestured briskly with a riding crop, dividing them into two lines. The motion was efficient, mechanical, as though he were sorting packages. One line veered toward waiting trucks. The other shuffled toward the long, low buildings beyond the wire. The air was filled with cries, confusion, the bark of commands. Thomas had expected to feel fear of discovery. Instead, he felt paralysis. He gripped the timber cart so hard that splinters cut his palm, yet he could not look away. His mind tried to translate the scene into numbers, into logistics, cars, loads, movement, but the image resisted such reduction. A child dropped a doll, its face pressed into the mud, and the sight of it broke something in him. These were not abstractions. These were lives reduced to lines and gestures, swallowed by the machinery of annihilation. Later, back in the laborer's hut, he forced his hand to record what he had seen. He wrote not in sentences, but in fragments. Officer with crop, 2 lines. Smoke constant, piles of shoes. His training told him to be precise, unemotional, to gather intelligence like weights on a scale. But the pencil trembled and the page filled with smudges. He could still hear the sound of violin music drifting from the camp gates, played by prisoners forced into an orchestra, the cheerful notes obscenely out of place beside the screams. History would later name these processes with sterile words: selection, extermination. But for Thomas, the reality arrived through senses that refused to forget. The stench of burning hung so thick he could taste it. The sight of guards laughing as they kicked a prisoner into the mud burned itself into his eyes. Even the silence of those too weak to cry became a weight. He realized then that the camp was not chaos. It was order refined into cruelty. Every movement had been rehearsed, every detail arranged to strip dignity before extinguishing life. Among the railwaymen, he caught whispers. One Polish worker muttered, "They empty whole villages in a single night." Another warned, "Do not look too long. Eyes can betray you." Thomas obeyed, lowering his gaze, but inwardly he counted, measured, catalogued. A spy's mind could not help but tally. He estimated hundreds stepping from that one train, perhaps more. Multiply that by the rhythm of arrivals he had already charted, and the numbers swelled beyond comprehension. Statistics took on the weight of ghosts. At night, in the safe house where he hid, he tried to align what he had seen with the reports already sent to London. He remembered John Karski, the Polish courier whose warnings 2 years earlier had been met with disbelief. Now he understood why. The truth itself sounded impossible. Fact and imagination blurred until neither seemed adequate. To describe it plainly would risk being dismissed. To embellish it would dishonor the reality. He sat for hours, staring at the cipher pad, struggling for words that could carry across oceans without breaking. Still, he wrote, families unloaded. Division at ramp. Women, children, elderly to one side. Trucks. Others toward buildings with smoke. Each phrase was clipped, factual, but the spaces between them held screams he could not transcribe. He folded the note, slid it into the lining of his coat, and handed it to a courier who kissed a small crucifix before slipping into the night. Watching her disappear, Thomas wondered if the words he had chosen would survive the journey, or if they would be swallowed by the disbelief that had greeted earlier warnings. The following week he saw again. Another train, another flood of faces, another doll dropped in the dirt. This time he noticed the details the first shock had obscured. The piles of clothing gathered immediately. The carts hauling away suitcases. The German guards blasting music from a gramophone to drown out the cries. It was a grotesque theater, designed not just for efficiency but for erasure, as if sound itself could be rewritten. He found himself gripping the timber cart again, nails digging into wood, praying silently that no one would notice his hands trembling. His internal conflict grew heavier. Every instinct as an operative told him to remain invisible, to focus on the rail schedules, to survive long enough to deliver intelligence that could help win the war. But another voice, quieter yet relentless, whispered that he was becoming a witness to something larger than strategy. Bridges and trains could be rebuilt. The lives he watched vanish could not. He realized with a shiver that his true mission might no longer be sabotage, but testimony. One evening, after smuggling himself back into town, he met with a resistance contact in the basement of a shuttered tavern. The man, a teacher before the war, poured him a thimble of vodka and asked bluntly, "So, American, do you believe us now?" Thomas had no words. He only nodded. The man leaned close, his voice low. "Then remember what you see. If you survive, you must tell. The world will doubt us. But they cannot doubt you." The burden pressed harder than any disguise. In quiet moments, he caught himself rehearsing explanations for an audience not yet assembled. He imagined himself telling London, Washington, the world, "This is real." Yet even as he imagined it, he doubted whether anyone would believe. His own mind resisted, recoiling at the scale. To witness was to be trapped between certainty and impossibility. Days bled into weeks, each train reinforcing the same brutal rhythm. He no longer flinched at the sight of dogs lunging, or officers waving their crops like conductors of death. Instead, he watched with grim focus, memorizing, storing detail after detail. The spy in him understood that only detail could survive disbelief. The man in him knew each detail cost a piece of his soul. On November 15th, as he prepared another coded dispatch, he paused over the cipher. The candle guttered, shadows twitching against the cellar wall. He thought of the faces pressed against slats, the children clutching their mothers' skirts, the smoke that blotted out stars. Then he wrote one final phrase, unplanned, unsanctioned. "This is not relocation. This is extermination." The words stared back at him, stark and damning, more dangerous than explosives. For the first time, he hesitated to send them, fearing not German interception but Allied disbelief. Still, he folded the paper, slipped it into its hiding place, and handed it off. When the courier vanished into the dark, Thomas remained alone in the cellar. His disguise lay folded beside him, the false French worker ready for tomorrow's charade. He looked at it with hollow eyes, knowing he would wear it again, knowing it would allow him to step once more into the machinery that devoured lives by the thousands. But now he carried a truth he could neither silence nor prove, a truth that threatened to consume him as surely as the smoke consumed the sky. In the weeks that followed, Thomas became less a spy in hiding than a man caught between two worlds, the smoke-choked fields of Auschwitz and the polished corridors of London where his words would either matter or vanish. Each night he bent over his cipher pad, candlelight trembling against cellar walls, forcing his reports into codes of numbers and phrases. Bridges destroyed, locomotives repaired, fuel convoys rerouted. These he recorded as expected, the currency of espionage. But always hidden between them, pulsed the other lines, the ones that carried not steel but ash. Trains sealed, children separated, smoke constant. Each phrase carefully chosen, clipped, factual, as though restraint might lend them credibility. Couriers carried these scraps of truth under their skirts, in hollowed heels, in bread loaves with false bottoms. One, a woman no older than 20, tucked his note into the hem of her shawl and laughed nervously, saying, "The Gestapo would never search something so ragged." Humor here was brittle, but it kept fear from shattering them. Thomas watched her disappear into the night, praying that each step brought the words closer to ears that would listen. But London, when it answered, did not answer with belief. The first reply that reached him was perfunctory. "Continue monitoring rail assets. Reports of civilian transports noted. Clarification requested." Clarification. The word burned him more than suspicion. How could Smoke need clarification? How could Ash demand footnotes? He realized then that disbelief was as great a barrier as the Gestapo. His frustration deepened when he learned from a resistance contact of Jan Karski's earlier mission. In 1942, the Polish courier had reached Roosevelt and Churchill with eyewitness testimony, even sketches of atrocities. The Allies had listened, nodded gravely, and filed the words away, too monstrous to absorb. They thought he exaggerated, the contact said bitterly. The truth always sounds like madness until it arrives too late. Thomas carried that bitterness with him, a shadow heavier than his disguise, yet he kept writing. Each day he risked exposure in the rail yards. Each night he turned shock into cipher. He adopted a style of deliberate understatement, fearing that urgency would be mistaken for hysteria. Where his heart cried out in horror, his pencil reduced it to metrics, estimated 1,000 per transport, average 3 arrivals per day. He became both spy and accountant, tallying a ledger no one had asked for but that history would one day demand. The act of writing itself became both penance and survival. Still, disbelief haunted him. Resistance couriers told him that London analysts debated whether his reports were contaminated by rumor. How could one camp absorb so many? How could the Germans divert such resources while their empire crumbled? Logic, even Allied logic, refused to believe that extermination could coexist with war. Thomas found himself writing sentences addressed not to London, but to his own conscience. "It is real. I have seen it." His disguise grew heavier with each passing day. At the rail yard he felt himself splitting in two. Outwardly he was the weary French worker, shuffling timetables, cursing coal dust. Inwardly he was a man screaming silently across continents. Once, as he fumbled with his forged papers at a checkpoint, a German guard smirked and said, "You French are like rats crawling everywhere." Thomas forced a shrug, feigning insult. Inside, he thought bitterly, if only you knew what your trains carry. If only your rats could speak. There were moments of irony so sharp they bordered on cruelty. One dispatch he received from London praised his excellent detail on locomotive maintenance schedules, but ignored entirely the line where he had described women and children being driven toward the chimneys. Another thanked him for noting morale among German rail guards, as if the laughter of men at the ramp were mere data points. He began to wonder if his pen was carving words into water, and yet proof began to gather like snowflakes, small, fragile, but accumulating into something undeniable. Soviet reconnaissance reported unusual smoke columns visible from high altitude. Resistance networks across Poland relayed identical whispers, camps, selections, mass graves. Intercepted German cables referred to special handling and evacuation actions. Piece by piece the mosaic formed, and Thomas's words fit into its gaps. His dispatches, once doubted, became threads in a larger fabric of evidence. But the proof came at a cost. Each time he etched another coded line, he felt a piece of himself harden. He no longer flinched at the stench that rolled across fields. He no longer trembled when trains arrived, each identical in their misery. He had begun to see with the eyes of a spy, cataloging what should never have been cataloged. And in that transformation lay a guilt that gnawed at him. To witness was to survive. To survive was to accept the role of scribe to horror. One night, as snow began to fall, he sat with a resistance fighter in a farmhouse kitchen. The man poured him a thimble of potato liquor and asked, "Do they believe you?" Thomas hesitated, then shook his head. The man slammed his fist on the table. "Then send them our dead bodies as proof." His voice broke into silence. Thomas stared at the cracked wood of the table, knowing he could offer no comfort. He could only write and hope, The irony of his trade gnawed at him. Spies were meant to carry secrets. He was carrying screams. Codes were designed to hide. He used them to reveal. His disguise was supposed to shield him, but it left him feeling naked before a world that might never acknowledge what he had seen. Still, he pressed on. He had no other weapon. By December, his reports had reached analysts who, reluctantly, began to concede. The phrase systematic extermination appeared in memos. Discussions stirred about how to respond, bomb the camp, publicize the truth, prioritize victory first. Each debate placed morality against strategy, human lives against military objectives. Thomas, unaware of the full debates, only sensed a shift in the tone of the messages he received. They no longer asked for clarification. They began asking for more. It was a hollow victory. Proof meant nothing if the killing continued. Each day's dispatch became both testimony and failure. Testimony that the world could no longer deny. Failure that it could not yet stop. The smoke still rose. The trains still clattered. The chimneys still burned. He knew that his words were seeds planted in a soil that might not bear fruit until millions were already gone. On a cold night near Christmas, he sat alone in the cellar, his disguise folded beside him, his pencil poised over a blank page. The candle flickered, casting his shadow long against the wall. He thought of the girl with the doll, the boy who refused his bread, the woman's hand reaching between slats for one last breath of air. He thought of them as proof, more vivid than any numbers he could encode. He whispered their memory aloud, as if speaking might preserve them, then bent over his pad. This time he wrote not only for London but for himself. If these words survive, let them serve as witness. If I do not return, let it be known that I saw. He folded the paper, pressed it into its hiding place, and handed it to the courier without a word. As she vanished into the night, Thomas felt the weight of his dual life pressed tighter. Spy, witness, ghost. And in that silence, broken only by the wind, he realized that the war he fought was no longer against Germany alone, but against forgetting itself. On January 27, 1945, Soviet soldiers marched through snowdrifts and barbed wire to find Auschwitz abandoned by its guards. The chimneys still warm, the air still bitter with ash. They found skeletal survivors stumbling toward them, too weak to cheer, some too weak even to speak. For the world, that day would become the indisputable proof of what had long been whispered. For Thomas, still alive and still in hiding miles away, it was the confirmation of every word he had risked to send. The truth he had carried in scraps of code had now emerged into the open, undeniable, seared into history. When the war finally ended, he returned to London with his forged papers folded neatly in his pocket, no longer needed yet impossible to discard. In the debriefing room, men in crisp uniforms asked him to recount his mission. They praised his details on rail convoys, on fuel supplies, on German troop morale. Then they asked about the other reports, the ones filled with words like extermination. Their pens scratched slowly, doubt lingering even in victory. Thomas spoke plainly, his voice steady but hollow. He described the ramp, the smoke, the doll dropped in the mud. He kept his tone factual, resisting the temptation to rage. The silence that followed told him the officers had heard, but whether they would believe, he could not say. In the months that followed, photographs from the liberated camp flooded the newspapers. The piles of shoes, the mountains of hair, the children staring into cameras with eyes emptied of childhood. These were the images that finally broke disbelief. Thomas studied them in quiet rooms, recognizing the fences, the towers, the gates he had seen with his own eyes. He searched the faces for those he remembered. The boy in the attic, the woman's hand reaching through the slats. He found no certainty, only ghosts. At night he dreamed of trains. In one dream, he stood on the platform as the cars opened, but instead of soldiers driving the people out, they simply vanished into smoke before his eyes. In another he tried to count, his pencil snapping endlessly, numbers spilling into infinity. He woke drenched in sweat, the echoes of dogs and violins tangled in his ears. He told no one. Spies were trained to bury secrets. He had not been trained to bury souls. Years later, when asked about his service, he would speak of rail schedules, of coded transmissions, of the absurdity of disguising an American accent with a few muttered French phrases. He joked once, half-heartedly, the accent worked. but it fooled me more than it fooled the Germans. Laughter filled the room, but his eyes drifted elsewhere, to memories that laughter could never touch. He had carried proof across enemy lines, but the burden of witness was something no mission could conclude. In the end, Thomas understood that his true assignment had not been sabotage or espionage, but remembrance. He had stood at the edge of the machinery of death, powerless to stop it, yet compelled to testify. And though the war ended, that mission never did.